Okay. All right. Tonight we have a 10-minute video during public comment, and then we're going to move on to our agenda items because we have a full agenda tonight. So Richard is here from the Starksboro Bristol Energy Group. Is that right? What you're calling?
Yes, I'm Starksboro Energy Committee, but we've been working with the Bristol Energy Committee as well too.
Okay. So I'm going to give him a few minutes, and then I'll check for other public comment, and then we'll move on. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your time. So I'm Richard Fazy from Starksboro. I'm the chair of the Starksboro Energy Committee, and we've been working with the Bristol Energy Committee and actually been expanding out to the other 5 towns as well too. We've got a joint meeting coming up to sort of coordinate efforts. And I just wanted to introduce the board to this concept of performance contracting, show a short video. It's a 7-minute video, I'm sorry. Thank you for giving me more than the 5 minutes. And then I'll just quickly wrap it up at the end. But we've been looking at this as this performance contracting concept as a way to pay for improving our schools through saving energy. So the concept is basically that we have firms that are willing to come in, take the risk that their energy improvements will generate enough savings to bring that forward and invest millions of dollars in our schools. You'll see in Virginia they put $7 to $8 million in improvements there without raising taxpayer money and achieving some goals through what we're paying for energy costs right now. So we'd love to explore this concept more with the board. I think it's a great opportunity for taking money that we are currently spending on electricity and fuels and investing it in our schools. So a little bit of video here on what Virgins has done, and then I'll wrap it up at the end. So hopefully this will work.
Hi, I'm C. Anderson Brown. I'm the Director of Human Resources for Addison Northwest School District. First, I want to really thank the taxpayers for supporting us last year when we came forward to ask for money to improve our safety and security systems for all our schools. I'm really grateful now that when I come to a school, that I know they're all following the same unified process, protecting our kids, protecting our volunteers, and protecting our staff.
I know that as a teacher, I feel more secure now with the security systems that we have in our school, and the students do as well. Some of them do complain that they can't come in as late as they had been previously without having to buzz in, but I think that in the greater sense, they feel more secure being here in these quite a couple times in schools these days.
Previously, we didn't have a way to monitor doors. Doors were alarmed. We didn't have automatically locking doors, especially at the front. Students, teachers, and community members were able to come in through almost any door. And now all traffic is directed to the front of the building at 8 o'clock or at a certain point during the day. The doors are locked and the front office staff monitors who's approaching the building and buzzes them in. So that's given us greatly improved security.
We have cameras on the exterior of the building, monitor the parking lots. If something happens at the school and a car is leaving the parking lot, we're catching that car along with the plates. It's all tied back to a central computer system that also runs the building HVAC, so the staff can have access to it remotely or on site. So this project at Virgins was designed to address some of the existing issues that the school had. One, we had a steam system that had steam running up to air handlers on the roof. Those coils would have problems in the wintertime, would freeze up, units would be turned off. We've had sprinklers that burst because of that, and also poor insulation in some areas. So as part of this project, we installed gas at the school. So we have natural gas, high efficiency condensing gas boilers went in. All the steam piping was removed, and we have a hydronic system in here now. The glycol, it is expensive. The least amount of areas that you glycol, the better. So we've isolated it with heat exchangers so that just the rooftop penthouses that have glycol have it up there, but we don't have to fill the entire system of the school with glycol and maintain that. We did a full lighting retrofit of all the schools. All the fluorescents are now LED. The fixtures that we used have dimmable capability, but they also have light harvesting and occupancy all built into the fixture.
Another aspect of the renovations that have impacted my classroom are the change in the lighting. The lighting is now LED lighting and is also dimmable. That aspect is really helpful with my presentations and other things that I do with the students, where I can vary the light intensity to make my presentation more effective.
Classrooms are lit adequately. They're not overly bright. People have commented on how much easier on the eyes the LED lights are than the old fluorescents, which would tend to develop a flicker after a certain amount of time. We've all gotten a little bit lazy because you walk out of a room without turning it off, and they dim and then turn off automatically. But that's an efficiency improvement that saves the district or the school a lot of money with electricity, because people don't need to forget or remember to turn lights off.
There was a 40% projected reduction in electricity based on our lighting upgrade here, and that will be verified as we install. We take our readings, and it's been helpful. Sure.
I think one of the most significant improvements is something that most people aren't even aware of. That would be the solar panels on the roof. In this day and age, I think it's really important to offset our energy use, and although we're not totally online yet, and we've reduced our electricity usage so significantly, the fact that we're considering the future and our children's future and going to sustainable energy resources, I think that's really important. And I think that was a really good decision that the board and the community made, and that was to provide for some sustainability with those solar panels. They will offset our electricity usage in the future.
All right, so at Burgent Elementary School, we installed a full sprinkler system, brand new. All the classrooms got sprinkler. We installed a brand new fire alarm system, along with air conditioning at different aspects of the building. The gym units got replaced. There were some loud gym units inside. Those were relocated to the roof, and new ductwork was installed in the gym. The kitchen was in rough shape before. We had an older stove. We didn't have fire suppression for the hood. All that's been upgraded. We have a new grease trap that's relocated outside. We have a new stove with a new hood that has a new fire answer system in it, a new captive air on the roof that brings in the outside air, and the exhaust. We have a brand new floor that went in, so it's been a great improvement from what they had before. The school was converted over to natural gas. We kept one of the existing boilers there and converted the burner to gas, and then added a new high-efficiency condensing gas boiler as the primary boiler that will save a tremendous amount of money on fuel as the season gets going.
First and foremost on this chilly morning is the fact that we have reliable heat and ventilation in the building. So after a weekend where the temperature plunged, the building was comfortable when we walked in. I don't believe there are any classrooms that have to have their windows open because they're overheated, and all classrooms are heated somewhere in the vicinity of between 68 and 72 degrees. So that's improved the learning environment for students and teachers.
So to summarize some of my feelings about this project is that it was a very well-run project. I think it was well-timed, that we really needed to do this work, that we've gotten a lot more perhaps than we could have bargained for in the initial scope of the work.
So that's just a snapshot of what Virginia was able to do with no money down. They were able to take that energy, their energy savings, and redirect it into security and indoor air quality and energy savings projects as well. And we'd love to explore this as an opportunity with the board. The contractors that did this, EEI, are happy to come in and explain how their business works. We wouldn't be obligated to use them. Typically go up to do an RFP process, or a couple other firms as well. I talked to somebody on the board from Virgins this morning. They're actually on track. They've saved 40% of their gas heat and 45% of their electric bills for over this past year after the project. So it's showing up, and the contractor doesn't get paid unless the results show up as well too. So we think this is a great opportunity that we should look into, and if you'd like to explore it, we'd love to have a half hour or something, 20 minutes, half an hour, and bring them in to look at this performance contracting in a little more depth. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment this time? Yes.
Hi, I'm Tom Warman. I live in Moncton, and I'm the co-president of the MAEA. And I just wanted to again express my concern about a motion that was passed unanimously by the board on March 11th, where the superintendent was directed to collaborate with the MAEA and then report to the board. My concern now becomes language, in that there's a directive in there about collaboration and a report happening. To my understanding, no report has ever happened, and I know no collaboration has ever happened. So I would just caution the board as you talk about, as you think about the strategic plan and the language you use around the strategic plan, especially around directives and collaboration, that you need to stand behind your words. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Yes. Could you
Unless someone else.
just state your name for our minute taker?
Yes, good. I'm John McCormick. I'm a member of the Bristol Energy Committee. And I know that this issue of the shared energy savings has been bounced around for several months. And it doesn't make sense that what the public wants to hear is that all the school districts are doing everything they can to save money. And this appears, with no money down, to be a way to get that going. I would say that you can actually begin now having the conversations, knowing that sometime in the near future there's probably going to be an RFP issued. But don't waste this several months of sort of kicking this ball down the road. I think it's time for the school board to just say, okay, let's bring some people in, let's see if this fits our needs, and get started. Thank you. And I would also say that the Bristol Energy Committee, and of which I'm a member, I'm going to urge that they take up this issue and sort of make it a public issue, that the public really needs to know that there's an opportunity here sitting on the table, and nothing seems to be happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? All right. We'll keep moving along. We have a consent agenda with items A through I. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda? Liz? Is there a second? Elizabeth? Thank you. All right. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Move down to executive limitations monitoring. The first is an update on proficiency-based learning. Patrick and I think Gabe and
Yeah.
Jess.
At this point, I'll turn it over to Jess Barracks and Gabe Hamilton.
Set up here. Well, we might need them soon, actually. You could leave them on. Thank you. So while we get settled in, hi, I'm Jess Barrowitz. This is Gabe Hamilton. I was really generous with him last week and passed along the cold that I had to him, so we're going to be really gentle with him today, right?
A little bit of a foggy head.
There you go.
I'll do my best.
But as we agreed earlier today, we could talk about this for 30 hours and not tire, so we won't do that to you today. We'll get a good 20 minutes and 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll be good. But while this is getting fired up, we really wanted to give you a chance to experience proficiency-based learning as in contrast to the previous traditional system. And so you're going to have to be getting a little active in this room. And so if you could please form triads, so groups of 3, and count off once you get into those groups 1, 2, 3. And a group of 4 is fine, but you just need one number 1, if that makes sense. So you need to be in groups of at least 3 and count off 1, 2, 3 in that group.
All right.
You could pull Patrick into one of your groups to make a 3.
Then we would have 3 and 3.
I sense Katrina and Susan may like to jump in to be a 3rd.
You're all 3.
Perfect.
And then we're supposed to count down, so are you with us? John, you can be number 1. It's not an
I think you're
I'm just going to be 3rd.
Yes, these guys.
All right, we have at least 3 in each group.
And then we're supposed to count out 1, 2, 3.
Perfect. You've got your number, you've got your groups. There we go. So some of this is really designed to give you an experience that might make you a little bit uncomfortable because we ask kids to be uncomfortable almost a lot of the time in their learning. They might be stretching themselves into a place that is unfamiliar for them. This is one way to do it, and it's not the only way. But what I would like for folks to do, the ones need to stay seated, and then everybody else, if you are willing, could stand up. If you are willing and able to stand up. And what I would like for folks to do, without any talking or anything like that, ones are going to evaluate everyone else's ability to do that. And you're only going to give an A through an F. You're just going to point to the person and you assess them. You say A, C, F, and that's all you're going to say. So you have about 10 seconds to do that.
Grade me quick, I can't retain.
Make sure you've graded your group members.
John, you're not even close. I'm only like a 1.5.
So make sure you've got your letter grades in your head. You've been assigned them. Not a lot of feedback there, right?
I'm going to give this a B.
So let's try this again. We can just stand. There we go. Now you have some criteria. So what I would like for you to do is take a minute and really check out this criteria. So if you are willing to do this activity, stay standing. To get started, stand with your feet shoulders width apart. Bend your knees slightly, or you could stay seated and bend your arms at 90 degree angles. That's a way to enter any of this in any way that would work for you. So 2, if you're willing to move on, stand with your feet shoulders width apart, bend your knees slightly, and balance standing on your left foot, and tuck your right foot behind your left calf. Or if you stayed seated, try to then take your bent arms and make your palms touch by layering your arms across. If you've got that, assessors, you should be looking at your people, watch what they're doing along the way. And if they're there, they can move on. So you're going to stand, you're going to bend your knees, you're going to balance slightly, and then you're going to add your arms. So if you've got your leg wrapped, you can then layer your arms and try to make your palms touch. And assessors, you should be looking along the way. To what degree are they doing this? For what length of time? And if you're really rocking this, hold it for a minute.
I can't even balance.
Now give your folks a grade on a scale of 0 to 4.
0 to 4. 2.
Where are they on this continuum?
Not balanced.
All right. If you've gotten your score, you can come back and sit down.
That's really all I care about. They're supposed to be perfect. I don't care about overtime.
Some are still trying to hold it for a minute to achieve that 4. We'll trust you that you could do that. All right, so if you've gotten your score, you can come and sit back down. And we figured you could use a stretch as well. This was multi-purpose. But as you are thinking about those two different experiences, just really trying to talk to someone next to you and talk about, was it different to be assessed in that way? Did you get more feedback along the way? What differed in being assigned a C as opposed to being told you were a 2? And just chat for 30 seconds with the person next to you.
Well, I was looking at yeah, see the Legos go slide. That's what I was
Yeah, exactly.
Correct.
All right. Finish up in another 10 seconds. All right. So let's make it a wider conversation now. What did you notice? Really just kind of shouting it out there. What did you notice about the difference between being told to do something and graded it immediately, or kind of seeing the steps involved, being more proficiency-based? I heard lively conversations, so I know you talked about it.
So were we supposed to give somebody a number grade after that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh.
Everybody should have had a
So
score.
fast I didn't follow.
It's nice to
I
be
wasn't proficient
able
in
to know that you were good at one part of it perhaps, and then maybe as you went further along you got a lower score, but to know that you kind of could do this part and build on.
You knew what the next steps would be to get there. Yeah. Give yourself to work on those own.
Yes, I gotta figure out the arms, but I can sit, right? Yeah. Other takeaways.
So you're graded on the finished product, and with proficiency, there's defined steps so that you understand what your progression is to get to the finished product.
I think they achieved at a higher level when they had the proficiency, because they knew like stand firmly in your feet, and they weren't like as wobbly when they did it that way as the first time. They were just sort of like still breathing, but almost falling over.
So you're hitting the nail right on it. Why are we moving to proficiency-based grading? And really, proficiency-based teaching and learning, it's not about grading anymore at all, is really that it does give a lot of these entry points into a progression of learning. So we're out of slides here. There we go. So really, that you noticed all success criteria was clear and articulated, right? You knew what next steps needed to happen, and you could give yourself some feedback about that. Your instructor or your assessor could have given you some feedback. I noticed some of that. No, get your arm over here, do that a little bit more. But everybody was really clear about what was being asked and what steps could be taken to get to where you needed to go. Models of success were shared in advance, right? But then what the steps were to get there were also shared, right? And then really thinking about, you got clear feedback that informed your next steps for learning, and you were empowered also to give some of that feedback to yourselves. You're not really dependent on an outside person to give you that feedback, that you can do some of that self-coaching to really transform your own learning as well. So it's really just wanting to give you an experience, so when folks are asking, well, what's the big difference between traditional grading or proficiency-based teaching and learning, you've experienced it for yourself, and you can kind of see that it's really a shift in philosophy. Rather than kind of a shift in grading practice. Gabe is going to really walk you into a lot of the nitty-gritty of how we're implementing here.
So, thank you, Jess. Just to clarify who I am and what my role is here. So my role is I'm a proficiency-based learning coordinator and coach. And my work in that role started about 4 years ago. I was a classroom teacher. I've been here at Mount Aid for 13 years now. And my colleague Andrew Jones and I started to do some of this work in our own classroom and did some research through a grant called the Rowland Foundation, and really expanded our understanding of what this looks like school-wide and district-wide as we make changes that are happening around the country in education. And so I'm going to kind of go through some of the basics of what, why, and how that might look. Some of the basic tenets of proficiency-based learning are that transferable skills and content are elevated in importance. So typically in schools that I attended, and probably many of you, content was kind of king. And in this model, transferable skills are also elevated. And that comes out of a lot of research that's been done around what determines success in terms of students being ready for college and career in their futures. And it's not a big surprise that there were all these skills that transcend content that were also highly valued, in many cases more valued than the content knowledge. Not to mention the fact that technology has kind of shifted that about a bit in terms of we can access content knowledge pretty easily and quickly now. And so it's less about having that all in your head, not that that's not important to have content, but that you also need to be able to manage that information and use other skills to grow and develop as a learner, a lifelong learner. As Jess articulated, the learning expectations are clearly communicated and linked to standards. And the standards thing is, of course, important as we think about commonality and equity within our own district, but also across the state and across the country. We have to have some sort of common language of what we actually want to know. Achievement is very directly tied to what we call learning targets, and that's very connected to the learning expectations. Learning targets is it's the language we use to describe what it is that we want students to know and be able to do at a given moment in time, and it's what the feedback is kind of hung on. So the feedback is all given around where they're at with specific learning targets, where students are at with specific learning targets, and there's a scale that accompanies that. In our case, in a 4-point scale, like the one you just saw. Another thing that's important is that work habits and academic achievement are separated. So one thing, if we're thinking about the traditional model, you took a course and you earned a grade. And that was a kind of a conglomerate of things. In many cases, behaviors were also a big part of that. So turning work in on time and so forth was just mushed into that grade. In a proficiency-based system, that's separated so that you can know where the work needs to be done. So it doesn't devalue them. It instead actually elevates them in importance, and it lets you be able to focus on those skills separate from the content. Formative assessments and feedback are used very frequently. So your teaching, the whole instructional sequence, as I'll show in a bit, there's a lot of feedback going on all the time based on these 4-point scales, but also based on language and so forth that can accompany the student work. And students have multiple opportunities to demonstrate proficiency. So it's not like you take a test, you're done, you move on, no matter what they scored. There's opportunities to learn from your mistakes and grow. In terms of the why, we kind of trickled it down into 4 main things. One is that this is based on the belief that learning focuses on growth and all can learn and demonstrate proficiency. So it's kind of this idea of meeting students where they're at and helping them to grow and improve. Clarity, clarity dissolves resistance. If students know what it is they're being expected to do, a lot of times they're a lot more able to hit that target. Flexibility in terms of having students, particularly here in high school, but all throughout their education, have voice and choice in what they learn. That engagement piece is often tied to personal interests and dreams, and that flexibility should be able to be manifested in the actual experiences that they engage in. So having voice and choice, flexible pathways to graduation, and personalization of learning are key. And then, of course, ultimately, better preparation for college and career. It's also embedded in state law and legislation. So Act 77 and the Education Quality Standards that the state of Vermont has to kind of back this work has really helped facilitate that change across the state.
I think as we talk about state laws have very low level of motivation for school transformation, right? There could be a lot of legislation that might invite a lot of changes in schools. And I would say Mount Abraham teachers have really welcomed the chance to innovate their practice and are doing it authentically. There are schools that are just saying, oh, let's take the old model and we'll shoe in this proficiency-based stuff, and it really is the old system just trying to go by new rules, and we are not trying to do that, and educators here are not trying to do that. We're really trying to give that flexibility and that personalization to give these really rigorous outcomes to all kids, and we're doing that deep, messy, transformational work.
And that is not easy work. You know, we are 4 years into this process here at the middle and high school levels, and it's really for students, for teachers, for community members to kind of grasp and wrap their heads around these changes, because we've all engaged up until this point in an educational system that's been pretty stagnant and for the most part in terms of what happens in schools. And this is a big shift. So we have to acknowledge that and understand that it's what's called a second order change. It really changes the way you think about teaching and learning, again, for everybody involved in what that means. So ultimately, we still hang all of this on the same basic questions that we've always asked about students. It's really, what do we want all of our students to know and be able to do? And of course, the ENDS policy is kind of the big umbrella over all of that. We have taken time to craft proficiency-based graduation requirements. So graduation requirements in traditional settings are based on credits. So you get 4 credits of English and 3 credits of math and so forth. And what we've done is, using those content areas and the transferable skills, we've built graduation requirements that are proficiency-based. So they're based on what we want students to know and be able to do when they graduate. And then from that, we can kind of unpack those into learning targets and scales and progressions that, through backward design, go down to the lower grade levels. And so this is kind of a graphic. I don't know why the color is very strange today up here, but these are our transferable skills. And so really, there's 3 components that we identify as graduation requirements. So it's no longer just credit-based, where you're earning credits, but instead, students have to have a personalized learning plan. They have to demonstrate proficiency in transferable skills, and they have to demonstrate proficiency in content areas. And this is kind of how it all gets tailored together. So if you think up here at the top level, these are the transferable skills and content proficiencies. Teachers have worked over the last 4 years to really unpack those into performance indicators that are aligned to those national standards, and then learning targets that they utilize and directly assess with students, and then perhaps in many cases smaller lesson targets that are like daily goals for the lesson. And so it all kind of trickles up into a system where we can really have a good sense of where students are at. Which gets to this slide of how will we know when they're learning. So it's not just about creating a curriculum that's proficiency-based, but it's really about impacting and affecting structures within the school that make this work. So classrooms are all operating now with clear learning targets, and the feedback that they provide is based on those learning targets. So students and teachers are, through formative feedback, are very well aware of where they're at with these various learning targets. Through our advisory system and the development of this year, kind of a relaunching of our PLP, or Personalized Learning Plan, students are able to kind of think about their learning and reflect on where they're at and think about next steps for growth. We do a lot to kind of connect. The HOW stands for habits of work. So we look every 2 weeks at students' habits of work to make sure students are engaging in the work and have the supports they need to be successful through the advisory model again. Screeners and diagnostics, course-based, proficiency-based portals, so students and families are given live feedback of kind of where they're at. As soon as a teacher enters the scores, they can see them and get that feedback. And then ultimately a transcript, and I'm going to take a moment to pass the transcript out. And one thing you'll notice, we think about the transcript as kind of this thing that our students get at the end. Well, we really see the transcript as a living, working document. And there's 2 sides to the transcript. And I won't even say which is the front and the back, because it doesn't really matter. In fact, I would argue that the proficiency-based side is ultimately what's really important. We still have a course-based side. So on one side, you'll see lists of courses by semesters that looks pretty traditional, where it's listed by courses. One thing you'll probably notice is that there's 2 grades for each course on a 4-point scale rather than the traditional letter scale. So that's kind of an aggregation of those learning targets by course. And the reason we've kept that is that, you know, if you think about a lot of the audiences that utilize this transcript, it's something familiar to them. So colleges and scholarships and students and families, even in some cases, are more used to seeing a course-based transcript. So that's important information and can be valuable. On the other side is the proficiency-based side, which is really what we're getting at. So when we say proficiency-based graduation requirements, 3 being proficient, we're really looking at students being able to demonstrate knowledge and skills around, again, both the transferable skills and the content. And again, there'll be some time for questions at the end, so I know that's kind of a lot to take in. Last few things is about responsiveness. So we think about instructional agility. So our teachers, you know, have a lot more information on hand about each individual student and can really adapt and change their instruction to meet the needs of those students. So we have lots of different ways of framing that, both through social emotional learning, things like the positive behavior intervention system, looking at things like restorative justice in our advisory system, personalizing experiences based on where students are at and what kind of learning experiences they're engaged in. So when students are signing up for classes, for example, they know which proficiencies a course will address. And so they're thinking about how they're enrolling for classes based on the proficiencies that they need, not just the credits they need to check off. The personalized learning plan and flexible pathways I talked about. And then we even have structures within the day that support this. So we have a block of time every day called flexible instructional time, where students, again, using the information they have, or a teacher can call back a student based on the information they're seeing to get extra support or extend learning in different ways. So as Jess kind of framed so well in that first activity, this is, you know, it's a process, right? And this is just one potential pathway. But one thing you'll know is that making mistakes is a key piece of the process. Making mistakes and then analyzing, fixing those mistakes, reassessing, and that loop could go on for a long period of time, because in this case, time is the variable and learning is the constant. So it may take some longer than others. You may have to reassess, make some more mistakes, get some feedback, practice again, and ultimately the goal, of course, is that everyone will demonstrate proficiency for those knowledge and content skills. So one thing that's really exciting to me is thinking, so we've been pretty focused, I have been very focused here at 7-12 in the proficiency-based learning. And as we think about the prioritization of the strategic plan, namely the expertise in learning objective number 2 is all about proficiency-based learning and extending it to a pre-K to 12 system. Because if you think about meeting students where they're at and moving them along based on where they're at, it doesn't make a lot of sense to start in 7th grade with that. It really has to be a continuum all the way down the grade levels. So it's very exciting to embark on the scaling up of this pre-K to 12 proficiency-based system. And finally, so this is kind of an overlay. These 3 points here with proficiency-based learning and personalized learning are things that Mount Abe has been focused on for some time, and we really have used the PLP to kind of connect those things and to overlay that with the 4 components of the strategic plan is an exciting thing as we really look to transform learning for our students with more engagement, clear direction, a real strong sense of purpose, and again, gaining the skills around content and transferable skills. So at this point, open it up to questions. That was my quick spiel. Yes?
I'm looking at this Lovely answer, thank you.
Yeah.
Is everybody end up with a Latin honors criteria, or is this just student?
This is so there's a lot of detail here, so you're referring to this side here where it's this,
Everything had a
Yes.
cum laude of some variety.
right, so there's specific criteria.
Okay.
So the idea behind that is rather than just an aggregate GPA where everything's kind of mushed together,
Yeah.
you can excel in certain areas and be recognized for certain proficiencies, even if you're maybe not excelling to that level in others. So it's about sharing, celebrating strengths, even if you might not have strengths everywhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but just this person doesn't have any twos, so what would happen?
Yes, this is
That's what I'm just
Very
curious, like,
proficient
you're
child.
gonna-
very proficient child.
Right, so then they won't have that next to it.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
And then what is the difference here between novice, intermediate, and advanced?
Great question.
Benchmarking?
Yes. So in a proficiency-based system, you have to benchmark things based on a rigor level, basically. And so where the student is being assessed with regard to the learning targets that trickle up to these proficiencies, they're going to be met where they're at. And in many cases, so as a starting point, we basically said, okay, novice is going to be most of our middle school experience, grades 7 and 8. They're going to be working for the most part with novice level targets. The 9th and 10th graders will be meeting the intermediate, working with the intermediate targets, and 11th and 12th graders will be working on the advanced targets. So there's a progression of learning. And that way you can meet the kid where they're at and celebrate the growth of the student. So, because if you just had one continuum, then students would be getting 1s and 2s in middle school, and that wouldn't feel very good, right? And then maybe 2s and 3s in 9th and 10th grade, and then...
Or they're getting 4s in 9th grade and
Right.
1s and 2s.
Right. Exactly. Other questions? Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering, so during the advisory time when they do the PLPs, so are they looking at their learning outcomes and then having conversations with adults about the personalized learning piece? Like how does that, I'm confused about the two different things and how they weave together.
So the personalized learning plan is first of all, we've kind of relaunched it this year as a starting point with a vision of what it will be. The reality right now is we've started with kind of getting everyone up to speed on how to interact with it. It's a Google platform-based thing where they're setting goals, they're keeping lists and track of accomplishments and so things. They're looking at they're doing like learner modalities assessments and learning about themselves and so forth. One of the big components that we haven't utilized a lot yet, we've just kind of scratched the surface, is it's framed around basically collecting evidence of the transferable skills so that they can make connections between what the work they're doing in the classes and those transferable skills, and they can kind of curate their best work that demonstrates the proficiency in those things. So it's a way of yes, looking at where they're at. We have them do things like look at the gradebook portal to see where they're at and set a goal on how to improve and get really specific about what they need to do. But they're also we're helping them, the advisors are helping to facilitate connections between classroom work and those transferable skills. So the transferable skills are kind of a new concept and because they're across classes, you kind of have to have a separate platform to unify them and help make sense.
Well, and the dream of using the PLP eventually for student-led conferences, so a student would just pull up their PLP and walk through their parent-teacher conference, and it'd be much more student-driven, and eventually really kind of what's called like defenses to graduate, like ways that students will have to give exhibitions and kind of show all of their learning, and it'll be warehoused in this kind of portfolio PLP. So rather than having an additional portfolio, everything is in this one PLP that will follow the student all through their learning.
That doesn't come in any kind of sort of end-of-year report to families, does it?
Not
yet.
No.
We're working towards that.
You're going to see a lot of foundational stuff that we have big dreams about.
Yeah. One thing they do utilize right now in terms of planning and personalizing, there is a course-based planning sheet in there so that they can think about what they might want to take and then adjust that based on the feedback they're getting and how they're, depending if their dreams shift and so forth, they can make adjustments. So there's this kind of digital thing, whereas it used to be every year they'd fill out this 4-year plan. Now this 4-year plan is this electronic living thing that they can utilize and tweak.
One of the comments was something to the effect that the process was for the knowledge regardless of the time, or it wasn't necessarily in sync with the time or something like that.
Right.
So do you see, or is, to me that sounds like grades are going to start blurring, where it's not 9th, 10th grade, 11th grade, whatever, that all of a sudden, based on where the student is at, it's going to determine what that traditional grade would be.
Excellent observation.
Yep. I mean, in many models of proficiency-based schools and districts, that is the case. It doesn't necessarily, there's a lot of reasons to maintain a continuum of age batching, I guess is the technical term for it. But there's a lot of reasons also to meet kids where they're at and progress them. And I think that'll be an interesting future. It doesn't mean one thing or the other necessarily, but it's definitely something we have to think about what the implications could be for the future and where we want to go.
I just have a question. I don't know if you know this in terms of like if a student wants to apply to college, like do colleges know this? Because like, I don't know, like we have a friend who their daughter has like a 4.6 or something, or 4.8 or something ridiculous. But like if this only goes up to 4, like colleges get that and like they'll still be competitive with those kids. That
one of the things that I did in the research is I met with admissions counselors and I sat on panels with admissions counselors and so forth, and they're very aware of this. Is not a unique thing to our school, or certainly not Vermont, and certainly not even the country. That this is happening across the country. So that's one piece, is they're well aware of the shift and excited for it. Most of them are like, grades have not been a good indicator of student success in our colleges. The other thing is that a profile accompanies a transcript. So whenever you send a transcript out from the school, it's accompanied by a profile that explains anything of that nature. So it would explain that we're on a 4-point scale, and whereas that other school you mentioned would explain that they're on a weighted scale that goes beyond 4-point. So colleges are used to navigating those kinds of differences as it is.
What are the feedback from the teachers? It seems like there'd be a lot more hands-on teaching instruction.
So I was mentioning that it's a second order change. So it's definitely, teaching is taxing. And so the change aspect I think is hard. But one thing, I'll speak personally, so when I started doing this in my own classroom, the results are so tangible in terms of being able to see the success that most teachers fully bought in. And it really, that's one thing pretty special, I think, about Mount Abe. When we started this work, it wasn't because of the state law, and it wasn't because of administrative saying we need to do this. It really grew from the ground up, through grassroots. So teachers, I was on a 9th grade team, so was my colleague Andrew, and kind of grew it from there. And then through this ongoing support of administration, we've been able to grow it in ways that it's really, we have a lot of buy-in. There's nobody saying this isn't worth it, but it is a lot of work. It's a, if you think about teachers, for the most part, are started teaching as instructors, where they're delivering content. And that's not a model that really works in this. You're more of a coach, so you're getting a sense of where all your students are at, and meeting them where they're at means you have to have a lot of things on hand to be ready to be agile to meet those needs. So it's a lot of work.
Some of our elementary schools are already doing this. Seems like Lincoln is.
I think there's elements of this, certainly. I mean, it's best practice in many ways. So a lot of the elements of good instruction are part of this. Proficiency-based learning just kind of helps make connections between things and approach it from a systematic viewpoint. So I do think we have a lot going on in this district that's going to be easy to harness and move forward. It's just about doing it in perhaps a little bit more coherent way.
I think that's the scaling up piece you were talking about, where we have faced issues as a 7-12 that elementary schools will not face in figuring out how to implement PBL. So they've always often have been on a 4-point scale, but maybe the learning targets haven't been as clear. So they have a lot of work to do on articulating their curriculum and really drilling down to the learning targets, where we're like, how do we graduate children and ensure that every child walking across that stage is proficient in the things that we have promised they would be? And so I think just the different pressures at different grade levels are unique.
We also have the need to look at consistency across, so all of our 7th graders are nicely housed in this one building. All of our 6th graders are in 5 different buildings. So to have that clearly articulated across schools also becomes really important.
You guys talk to students. I know I have a 12th grader, a 9th grader, and a 7th grader, so we've lived through the whole transition. And the 12th graders might have a lot to say because they, in 9th grade, teachers were practicing on them. I mean, you had my daughter Cora gave, I know, in 9th or 10th grade, I can't remember. But, so they're, in a way, were the guinea pigs, but yet they weren't under the system 100% yet. And my 9th grader now is 100% under the system. So I think, and I always think exit interviewing students is a good idea, but about this particularly, this year's graduating class, I think has seen it all and transformed and seen how that works. So have you guys gotten feedback from students?
So student feedback is definitely something that has been really important in this process. So students were involved in the development of the PLP. Students have been involved through a variety of mechanisms, including the advisory system and circle time to give feedback to the system. I like the idea of an exit interview because you're right. I mean, in some ways, that class has experienced it all, and then the next year's graduating class will be the class in 2020, which will graduate on this Proficiency-Based system. I will say that I think all of the students have benefited from the changes that have happened, no matter where they're at. No, that's a good point.
The learning targets are, some of those must come down from the state as well. So because our learning targets, even though we shape them, they are kind of standardized outside of the school.
They were all originated from content area standards, so Common Core standards, C3. And so I think that's some of the reason why our teachers really took some of the shared ownership of the work really early on, was that we weren't prescribing what learning targets. That's teachers' work. That is their daily work. They'll have maybe one learning target for the day or for a couple of days. And so it's that's been some of the beauty of the work, is taking this huge standard and chunking it down to what happens on a daily basis or a weekly basis to make sure that we're leading to that big standard. But the standards are really what are prescribed at a state and national level, and teachers really, the learning targets are where they get to own it and give that progression to their lessons and their units.
And then I was also wondering if you could get a link of this on the minutes so that we could again carefully. And how do you feel like the fit blocks and the learning commons are being utilized? Like, is that coming to, are teachers being able to collect students and use them the way that you would hope they would be able to?
That's a good question. I mean, to be perfectly honest, not to the extent that we would hope. I think you're seeing a lot of foundational pieces that we really are refining year by year by year to kind of watch. Okay, we know this is the right move for the system. Let's kind of give some guidelines and see how it works out, and kind of, okay, we piloted it, and let's make it stronger next semester or next year. So no, but is it better than what we had? Absolutely. And so that flexible time is really being used in some innovative ways. And for others, it maybe isn't really supporting specific proficiency work for that child every single day. But we've got revisions to the handbook for fit in place for next year. There's all these different pieces where we're trying to get good work groups and teacher groups to really come around and say, let's look at how we implement it, how can we improve going forward. And Learning Commons, I think, is another one where we've got interventionists that we never had before that are really targeting skills that children will need to graduate with. We must ensure we lessen these gaps now. And next year, Learning Commons will look a lot different than it currently does, and that's just from the beauty of pulling teachers together and saying, the concept was great, we know we need to change the system as much as we change our practices, but how do we keep growing and improving? So we're also modeling what it is to be in kind of a growth mindset. We didn't nail it the first time. We're going to make some mistakes. We're going to keep learning and growing with kids, which I think gives some of that authenticity too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that instructional sequence can be applied to exactly what we're doing, and we're able to take feedback from teachers, from students, and really analyze what's working, what's not, what tweaks can we make moving forward. That's been something that's been very evident.
Do you, when they open up the portal, does it show a grade in high school in the class, or does it show this side, whatever side?
Yeah, so in the portal right now, it is organized by course and by habits of work and academic score. So the proficiency, it's still listed underneath that by proficiency, so they can see where they're doing each of the proficiencies within the course. But the development of the across course portal aspect it's not live yet.
Just curious
No.
how they visually saw it. And how have you dealt with special ed
This has come about actually in an era in which we are more inclusive than we have ever been in the school. And one cool piece, and I think it was on one of your slides actually, a lot of our co-teaching pairs, they will modify the curriculum to kind of walk back the standards to where the student is at and start to chart out what are the learning targets for that particular child. So they're not missing first instruction with their qualified teacher, but then they're getting specialized instruction in what they really need to grow to really lessen the gap from both ends.
I have one more. Are your instructional coaches creating targets that are then utilized across, like they get it for
Our
like
teachers,
across the school, or I mean, you won't really answer the lower grades, but.
so at the high school, through backward design, we started with our graduation requirements and the national standards, and we unpacked those into learning targets. And teachers in departments and across departments for transferable skills did that work. And then, utilized them with students and got feedback. Because one thing about a learning target that also differs from a standard is that it needs to be accessible to the students. So typically they're in ICANN, student-friendly language. And so that work in refinement of those has been going on. And in the elementary schools moving forward, because we're working on this idea of backward design, we have those graduation requirements. The next level down is what's called performance indicators. And that's really prioritized standards, because you can't teach all of the standards. There's been lots of research that says if you tried to do all the standards, kids would be in school for 30 years, or I can't remember the amount of time, but it's, so every school has to do some sort of prioritization. And the good news is that will have been done for elementary teachers. They'll be able to iterate and provide feedback, but then they can unpack those into learning targets. So they have some starting point, rather than just like choosing standards from the national bank of standards, so to speak.
I can give the short answer to the elementary school work, and Katrina may elaborate on this, but the short answer is that's work that elementary teachers need to come together and do. It's not so much that the coaches are going to determine those learning targets. Teachers will have to come together from multiple schools to discuss at the elementary level, based on this backwards design, and what those standards are, what then are our learning targets, and then there's a lot of work, even once that's been determined, to adhere to those learning targets that have been collaboratively developed, develop assessments that align with those learning targets, all of that work, and coordinating that across 5 elementary schools becomes the work for years to come.
And it is, there's been research about this now. With implementation of proficiency-based learning that hasn't gone so well, it's when learning targets are dictated. Teachers have to be involved in the development of those. It's really essential, because they're going to be the ones working with the students that are working on those, developing the assessments and the instructional sequences that have to happen. If they haven't grappled with the learning targets themselves, it makes it really hard to do.
If you have somebody who's a 4 on something, and when they're in a novice course, what do you do?
This is fun explanation. No, it's good. This is the fun stuff.
No, yeah, it's great. Well, one thing that, you know, when we say meet the student where they're at, one thing that's important is knowing where they're at, right? And in a truly proficiency-based system, hopefully we would know before they start, you know, they might be in the wrong course. So that's one thing, right? Like if they're getting in the class and they're already getting 4s on day 1, then we need to seek other options. There's also things about pacing, right? So maybe they need to move at a different rate. Maybe they need to dig deeper into that content. There's a lot of different options, but I would say it's not, I mean, it's easy to think about what do we do if they're not, but I think it's equally important to think about what if they've already gotten there.
Well, and this is like way getting into the weeds, but this is what I anticipated that your answer would be. If you think about someone who, at the advanced level, got a 4, you would say, oh wait, am I saying that right?
Novice level 4?
Well, a novice level 4 would be an intermediate level 2.
Okay.
Right, and so if you can see, like, you'll see how they kind of shift and overlap, so that your novice kind of advanced piece then drops down to be the lower level of intermediate, and then drops down to be the lowest level of advanced.
Yeah.
So you could have a student who, you know, might get a 2 at the advanced level, and we consider that a 3 at the intermediate level, meaning you're proficient. Yes, I know it's a lot of jargon to go along with it, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, I think it's great, because what the kids get, when you look on the computer, which I do with my kids about every 3 weeks to make sure they're not, whatever, you know, they get like 12 bar charts for each class, so you know exactly, and they know exactly if they're involved, what they need to improve. So it might even be 15 on something. So that's really cool. But, and so I think that is really great for everybody. I think as we go towards proficiency, again, you're saying we can't forget the kids that need extension. And I know my daughter applied to college this year, and so we've been talking to parents about open houses and whatever. And so, and if a lot of the seniors were to do an exit interview, which they may never do, they want more advanced placement classes in the building with Black bodies if possible, just to keep those kids extended that do get the 4s, and then how do they, you know, taking stuff online is okay with the point. So I think we have 6 AP classes here, and there are some, of course, bigger ones that have like 30. So is there a way to grow that so the kids here can take advantage of that too? But it's definitely awesome to be able to see exactly where your kids are at, and they know exactly, oh, okay, we're going to work on that. So it's really a good system, I think. Awesome. As a parent with 3 kids.
Glad to hear it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're all set for that now. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
All right, the next is an update on the financial report. What is in your packet? Anything you want to add, or you want anybody to know about it?
I just met with Cheryl today and kind of got an update on where we're projecting to land with the fund balance at the end of the year. Right now, projecting a fund balance somewhere in the neighborhood of $525,000, which I think is good. If you'll recall, we used about $900,000 to apply to offset taxes for the next year. So if we land at around this 525, we're going to be plus or minus $400,000 less than that, which is, it's a lot of money, but it is somewhat incremental in terms of bringing that amount that we carry forward to offset taxes down to a more sustainable level. So all in all, I think that's happy news. And frankly, if it were to grow before the end of the year, I think we would want to talk more about applying some of that money to our reserve fund for anticipated facilities needs that we'll talk about in a couple of agenda items.
So the last update was more in the 280 range.
We were at one point looking at, around 300,000, yes,
Yeah.
and now it's looking like more like 525.
Okay.
As things become, as accounts are sort of closed, encumbrances are getting more refined, we're getting closer to the end of the year, we're able to dial in a little bit better. It'll actually be, probably sometime early to mid-August before we have it really pinned down after we close the books, and then it'll be audited after that, which we just recently learned that our auditor suddenly has retired, and we are now going to need to... Why not? Just keep it coming. So we're going to have to put out a request for a new auditor, which is not a good, it's not good timing for that because most schools have already established who their auditor is, like we had. So the availability of auditors will be less than it might otherwise have been. So we're still going to hope that we can get a really reputable firm that can do this work and have it done by the end of December at the latest. I'll keep you updated. But yeah, it's looking a little better on the fund balance side, and a little bit better at the food services, the next agenda item. But it's looking a little bit better on the food service side too, by about $8,000 or $9,000 in last month that we talked about this.
Any other financial questions? How about food service questions?
Is the healthcare picture cleared up at all from the debacle?
Yes, it's cleared up.
Yeah. Just in terms of your ability to predict the...
Well, no, it's not that clear.
No, but
it's
the amount
always
that you would
sort of a
set
moving
aside,
target.
how much of it you think you're still going to end up using?
Right, so we're in better shape next year in anticipating what these costs will be than we are this year. It's probably in part because if you recall, the contribution from the general fund to food service had for a long time been $195,000. In anticipation of some savings with our collaboration with Addison Northwest, we reduced that contribution to like 173 or something like that. And then after which we learned of healthcare costs, et cetera, increasing. So that contribution in next year's budget will be back at 195. So that's going to help offset some of those anticipated healthcare costs. Probably not all of it. We'll have to do another look at that in the fall as we build the following year's budget and try to account for that.
I guess what I was driving at was the amount of the HRA money that you would set aside.
Oh, okay.
That still wasn't cleared up because of the delay in processing?
It's definitely still not clear.
Okay.
It's getting clearer, but to my most recent knowledge and conversations with Cheryl in our business office, they're sort of checking off more and more of those things that are coming in from clearing up the mess from one or two different companies ago that we were working with. But we're not cleared up yet. And again, that'll probably be August. And that's, as August gets closer, that feels more and more of an optimistic view as to when that's all going to get cleared up. But we're feeling good about what we had reserved. We're not anticipating we're going to overspend what we had budgeted to spend for all of that. Mm-hmm. It's just unclear how much of what we had budgeted for that are we going to not spend.
Right.
And our best guess at this point is included in that $525,000.
Okay.
And we're usually pretty conservative in our best guesses. So even this 525 should be a pretty conservative 525. Unless some crazy unexpected thing happens in the next month and a half. Which is possible.
It sounds like you're inviting it.
No, I'm embracing reality.
Any questions? All right. Next is an update on the strategic plan.
Yeah, so teams are beginning to form, and actually it was, you heard one of our co-facilitators up here tonight, Gabe Hamilton. So we have those two priority areas that were identified from the strategic plan. Gabe referenced one of them. The other's in the social emotional learning realm. And we have implementation teams that have formed, and they're scheduling meetings, and they're going to really get going. The team that I'm still working to build is the oversight team. I do have two board members in Liz and Krista that have expressed interest in being on the oversight team, but there are some other important positions that I didn't get interest from, so I'm now sort of knocking on doors to try and drum up some interest to ensure that we have the kind of representation on that team that we're looking for. So once that team's formed, all of the teams to sort of move that work forward will have been formed, and we'll we'll continue that work. And some of that work is, those teams will be meeting soon. We talked about the articulation of the curriculum, the proficiency-based curriculum. There's a group of teachers from the elementary schools, just the elementary schools, Katrina?
Yes.
Already planning to meet with the help of our coordinators at the end of June.
Some have already started meeting today.
Okay. But they'll begin meeting before the end of this fiscal year to start mapping out that work and how to begin building that articulated proficiency-based curriculum pre-K through 6, knowing that 7-12 has done a lot of work already. And it's a heavy lift to articulate what we want our students to know and be able to do across the subject areas, and sort of wrestle with what we all think as individuals and land on something we can all commit to. It will be a lot of great, messy, and important work.
Is there any discussions with Jen's district and their district as far as bringing proficiency based system along uniformly, so there's some interaction, or so there's some transferability there?
Not entirely. Nothing comes to mind for me. I'm thinking about Act 77, which was legislated, which is part of what is ensuring that schools are all having these kinds of conversations. But the standards are pretty well established. The challenge being, as Gabe mentioned, I think one study I saw said to really to teach all of the standards that are in the Common Core standards, the Next Generation Science standards, the Social Studies standards, kids would need to be in school from kindergarten through grade 21. That's not feasible. So what ends up happening is we have to really think about, with that breadth of standards, what then are we saying are the standards we're going to focus on. From that, then, and so there's not commonality necessarily district to district, and even currently there's not commonality within district. So then to dial even deeper than that and think about learning targets seems far away to do as an Addison County.
I just go back to that nasty little statistic that the population of schools is declining, and someone commented about more LP courses and whatnot. And it seems to me like there needs to be some consolidation potentially, and then to consider that or not to consider that, because these very energy intensive structures that we put in place are unfortunate.
Yeah, there have been like broad stroke conversations about, does it make sense to think about consolidation in terms of districts within Addison County, and there's some interest in that, and there's some that are not so interested in that, as you can imagine. And even, we've been working to partner more and more with some of our Addison County neighbors, and to some extent there comes a point at which in terms of sharing positions, sharing various things, it becomes tricky at some point. How many things can you share while still being your own district without having effectively made the decision to merge districts in some capacity? So it seems perhaps at some point that's a conversation that ought to happen, and then we can have a plan and we can be intentional about how we continue to work more closely together. But in the absence of a bigger plan and a bigger conversation, it felt presumptuous to just continue down the path of sort of merging without having officially had the conversation. So we're sort of in that strange place right now.
It's a can of worms.
Oh, it's
like, you can just see all this.
There are many cans of worms. Yeah.
Well, as you point out, there's food service, a couple of sports teams, and Middlebury's an international baccalaureate school, so I don't know how well that could merge with schools that weren't, because they have certain standards they have to meet, which are higher than ours or for Jen's.
And their population is a little bit larger, so some of the AP question comes down to numbers, right? So if we offered 30 AP courses with our student enrollment, we'd have AP courses with 1 or 2 or 3 students in it, and the impact that has on what that means for other courses unless we really wanted to add a lot of staffing. So numbers play a role in that, and that's where I think the potential to continue to collaborate offers something. Transportation gets in the way, so but yeah, to an extent, some things come down to numbers and what we can offer based on the number of students we have to be able to support offering those things without and actually bringing in a person to do that. There's a lot of virtual high school options, things like that, but to bring a faculty member on to instruct a course that's going to have 2 kids in it creates a pinch somewhere else in some way. So that's the give and take that becomes kind of tricky without the numbers.
Okay. Keep moving along. Next is a discussion item, Mount Aid locker rooms that we all had a lovely tour of.
Yeah. And so we've had conversations, I think, here about the fact that we've been working with architects to get a sense of like what's the plan to fix the locker rooms properly so that they're fixed and it's a multiple decade fix and not a sort of continued Band-Aid fix. And we knew we had some of the money, so we had the $1 million in the budget for next year, which was great, and we were hoping that that would address the concern. And we had the $600,000 in the reserve fund, still have that. Unfortunately, after talking with architects and working with engineers to estimate those costs, that won't be enough money still. It came at about $1.9 million. Closer to 1.8 if we would have been able to pull it off for this coming summer. There are a couple of reasons why we can't do that, but the cost escalation of 5% annually bumped it up to about 1.9 million. So, and the reasons being we have to pre-qualify, because of the cost, anything over 500,000 we have to pre-qualify bidders, and that's a 60-day process. And so already that 60-day process puts us past a window in which we could secure a contractor to come in and do that work before the start of next school year. And it would be difficult, if not close to impossible, for this building to have no locker rooms for a large portion of the school year. So all of that information led us to targeting hopefully next summer to be able to do the locker room work. In the meantime, we still have mold in there, so we're going to have to eradicate the mold, patch it back together for a 1-year fix in the hopes of being able to fix all 4 locker rooms properly in the following summer. That's the current thinking. Utilizing the money we hope to have in the general fund, because now we're talking about not the next budget, but the one after that that hasn't been voted on or even built yet. So it's assuming that money stays in there, and it's assuming that that budget passes. We then have money from the construction services fund to add to whatever we have in the reserve fund to try and come up with enough money to fix the locker rooms, which is why if our current year fund balance gets a little bit better, my recommendation would be to put a little bit more money into that reserve fund so we can fix this problem.
Was that number for all 4 locker rooms or just?
That was for all 4. All 4 very much are in need, and part of the challenge was if we're only going to fix 2 locker rooms, I'm of the perspective that it needs to be a boys' locker room and a girls' locker room. For equity purposes, I also think Title IX, we'd at the very least be flirting with being in violation of Title IX if we only fixed 2 boys' locker rooms and didn't touch 2 girls' locker rooms. And then when you factor in, if we were going to do 2 locker rooms, it makes sense to do the 2 bottom level locker rooms, because those get the most use by most kids. But some of the infrastructure needed is HVAC and everything else, so we'd have to be going through the upstairs locker rooms to be able to tie the HVAC and everything into the roof. We'd also have to tear into the upstairs locker rooms to an extent to reinforce the structure to hold the new HVAC work. So we lose, there's an economy of scale in doing all 4 because of all of that.
Right. So you did, that answers the question.
Sir, is it possible to do the 2 boys' locker rooms and change one of the girls to a boys' room for the year and then do the next set? Like try to just stagger it and get it going so we're not spending money on a fix?
It is possible, although also complicated. Because the two locker rooms are very, very different in size and the number of students they can accommodate, et cetera. So I do wonder about Title IX compliance there as well, when you have one locker room that's effectively twice the size of the other. And I've heard stories of Title IX police, for lack of a better term, checking square footage to be sure that it's to the square foot comparable.
Is there like a classroom that could be like just take the old lockers out and put them in there or not?
I don't believe we have any classrooms that are completely empty right now, so I don't know what would get moved out of a classroom and into the locker room temporarily. Yeah.
I personally have a hard time spending the money on a one-year fix.
Completely agree. And we don't really know the extent yet what the one-year fix is going to be.
Okay.
Because we haven't, we know the mold's there, we have the area quarantined off, but until they can really get in and start tearing the walls apart, it may be one wall that has rotted studs, that has the mold on both sides of that wall. Maybe it's just tear that wall out, rebuild that wall, put in some shower heads, or not put in shower heads, and the mold is taken care of. So that may be a relatively inexpensive fix. And the framing for that wall probably gets to stay, and then we'd be intentional about what we're doing, and we'd put in the whatever framing it calls for in the plans that we now have, so that we can be thinking ahead as much as possible in making that fix. But we know we can't afford to fix them the way they ought to be fixed right away. Nor will we have even if we could afford it right away, we're past the timeline that contractors will come in. So even if we did 2 locker rooms, that's probably about $1 million. It means we still have to get pre-qualified bidders. It means we're still going into the school year, which isn't great. Even if it's just 2 locker rooms that are put out of commission for what could likely be months.
Caleb?
So is the $1 million gonna be set aside for that purpose in the future, or are you gonna use it on something else? Or?
So probably a combination, that we're still waiting on that. So Bob Mason, who I've talked a little bit about, who's been helping us with some business manager type of things, is looking, his experience has been that there's more flexibility in moving funds from this fiscal year, for example, or next fiscal year into a reserve fund. So he's exploring that a little bit more to sort of give some ideas about what we can do. But the thinking is a portion of next year's $1 million, in addition to whatever we might be able to scrape by with out of this year's fund balance, put those combination of monies into that reserve fund to grow that to probably over $1 million, to then use the following year's money. Hopefully we have that $1 million, maybe even more, in the budget, to then piggyback with our reserve fund, and there's enough money to do the project. And that becomes the challenge, right? So it's interesting. So it's a different architectural firm and a different cost estimator than what we were using with the Mount A renovation project, and just the locker rooms came in at $2 million. So if you scale those 2 locker rooms out to the rest of the entire building, it holds true that the cost estimators and the architects from before, given the scale of the work we were looking at, weren't way off the mark in terms of what it costs to renovate a building.
I guess one thing I'm a little concerned about with that, and I think your explanation means it's not a problem, but we were really close to the excess spending cap this year, as it turned out, and that construction line item, of course, counts against that.
Yep.
And so our ability to pass another $1 million next year, which we don't know, if we were to have kind of a significant amount of this left over and rolling to the next budget as well as a new construction line item, I just worry that could start to be the fact, whereas if we had a bond payment, of course it doesn't count towards it.
Exactly.
But we kind of know that we're close to that line, and I'd hate to see this construction line item be the thing that pushes us over it.
Exactly.
So I guess that just rings me as like, oh, well, that either means we need to ask for less construction money next year, maybe, or I don't know what, but it just seems like we might wind up with 2 years worth almost in 1 year.
Yeah, it's hard for me, exactly. So The reserve fund, I don't think counts against us. I'll have to confirm that, but I don't think the reserve fund counts against us in terms of our spending per equalized pupil.
Okay.
In terms of that spending threshold, because that's not in the general fund. That's in a separate fund outside of that. So the more we can put aside from this year's fund balance and next year's $1 million in the construction services line, the less we have to depend on being in the following year's budget to make this project feasible. So, because I can't see us exceeding the spending threshold, period. However we make sure that doesn't happen, whether it comes from construction services or something else, something has to give. I think that's kind of a hard line as I've sort of interpreted our trajectory, the conversations we've been having, conversations in the community. I can't imagine a budget passing that exceeds the excess spending threshold and therefore generates lots of additional taxes.
Sir, because it appears that we're going to need time, we're going to be at least another year until we go through the process of the 60 days quotes and everything. Would it be an option to piggyback this onto some of the energy retrofitting that the presentation today? That would potentially save us money to turn around HVAC. You're talking about different energy solutions that we need to incorporate into this renovation.
Mm-hmm. And part of my understanding as to how that performance contracting works, and they talked about a lot of the safety and security upgrades, as I understand it, there's a bond process that you have to secure a bond, and the payment for the bond is made through energy savings, and that's sort of how that kind of all works. And the challenge with that approach being, to go out for a bond right now to, take care of energy savings, or even if the bond is totally paid for by the energy savings, the fact that we have to bond now and then at some point not too far down the road to go out for a bond again, there's a political concern there in doing so. And, ahead of conversations about what do we do with facilities, to invest lots and lots and lots of money on energy savings across all of our schools when we don't really have a long-range plan yet on what exactly that's going to all look like, seems a little bit premature. And that's where, for me, conceptually, I'm behind the idea in concept. I just wonder about the timing of it all.
Mr. Freezy sent me a message asking for agenda time, and I didn't give him the agenda time because I really felt like the community engagement group has been out there, saying we want their feedback, and to give somebody time at the table where we appear like we already have, we're going to do this, when we're at the same time saying, people, what do you want to talk about? We want to hear what you want to talk about. I felt like it wasn't fair to either group, either the people were asking or to him to say, yeah, we want to hear your idea because we'll consider it, or to the people we're asking for information to say, yeah, we want to hear about, oh yeah, don't pay attention, we're not doing anything over here kind of thing. I felt like, if we're really asking for information, let's ask for the information and gather it and do it thoughtfully. So that's just where I was coming from. Kristen?
So it seems like if we spend $2 million on locker rooms, then that affects any comprehensive building changes that may occur, because we're not going to knock those down, right? So I know that Burlington just passed a bond, and they're actually going to blow up 2 buildings after they add on to their other building and make 1 building. They're going to blow up 2 of them. A friend of mine works in one of them. She says, they're going to blow up my building. It's good that they're blowing it up. It should be blown up. But again, we're starting to have to do the Band-Aid effect, which I know as a Moncton board member for 7 years we did, and actually it's a small building, so the Band-Aid effect actually pretty much worked. But that's a tiny building and it's newer also, I think, right? Or parts of it are newer. So I'm just concerned that what's going to pop up next year,
Right.
and what's going to pop up the next year, and
Especially
what's going to
when-
pop up the next year. So, our hands are tied. And we have to do it this way, but it seems really not optimal. So I just wanted to put that out there.
That's the challenge, right? So depending on what pops up, this popped up, and the proper fix is 2 years worth of all the money we have available to spend to fix anything. I mean, not necessarily anything, like the routine maintenance kind of stuff is in separate line items, but in terms of construction services, $1.9 million is pretty much all of the $2 million we'd have over a 2-year period to invest in this one thing that has presented itself. The other challenge being, I think it's wise to spend the money to fix the problem that presents itself the right way, so it's not, you know, tomorrow's problem as well. And it's tricky because you are gambling a little bit that something else really big isn't going to pop up as you're trying to fix the last emergency that has presented itself.
So we're waiting for the community engagement process to be done to then look at a more comprehensive building solution?
Exactly, that's my thinking. And then just I think we'll talk more in a little while about what's going on with the community engagement group.
Thank you.
Chris, just as it pertains to this, I think it is something we should keep talking about because it's really tricky. The building of relationships with our community is a long-term, long-range process, and it's going to be ever less. Like we should always be doing that work. And at the same time, we have these emerging issues, and so I think that engagement group will take direction from this board in terms of what the board needs and when. And at the same time, that committee will be able to inform the work of the board. So I think, it's not, I think that group has the idea that regardless of what we talk about in the fall, we're going to have conversations at the board level about facilities. And so how those conversations come about is still a work in progress, but I don't know that we're going to get to completion of our engagement work before we need to make some decisions. So, I'm struggling with how to do that because the pressures keep mounting and mounting. And yet that work is really important. So I don't really have anything concrete to say except that it is an issue that I think we need to keep talking about.
So in the plans for the renovation for the school, were the locker rooms going to be moved and demolished?
No, so the locker rooms, they were going to be demolished, but they were going to stay where they are. That was part of the thinking too, was to fix them properly. In all the versions of the renovation that we've looked at so far, those locker rooms have stayed where they are. So we can fix them properly and not necessarily impact the sort of grand scheme of things with the renovation project.
The money away once
So that takes off, so if it's $2 million, not next year, but the year after, let's assume it's a couple of years later that the renovation happens, we've saved that $2 million out of the cost for renovation, and it's 5% escalation. The problem being the other 20-something million dollars is continuing to escalate at 5%. So it's still not great money to wait, but at least this checks something off the list that would need to be done otherwise.
So things that were on Joel's list from the last meeting, like the pool pump and that sort of thing, are those set aside trying to save money for this, or is they were already budgeted and they're going to go ahead?
They're already budgeted and planned for this current year, so before the end of June. So security cameras in all of our schools, PA systems that function in all of our schools, lock improvement in all of our schools, the pool issue that Joel was talking about, which is really boils down to a safety concern with our filtration system and kinds of chemicals and access to it, everything. Not all the pool work that Joel was talking about. Joel was, I think the total, which was sort of from the filtration system all the way up through to really bringing it back to sort of its original condition, was around $250, I think. And we're planning, we have sort of encumbered $100,000 of that this year, which really takes care of the worst of the filtration. So trying to chip away at that a little bit too.
Okay, I'm sure this will be another discussion item. It may be a regular discussion item. All right, the next is an action item. So I need a motion to accept the monitoring report for 2.2 treatment of staff.
So moved.
Andrew, is there a second?
Sure.
Sarah? All right, any discussion?
Yes.
Sarah?
So in the summary of the administrative survey results, they were combined with the survey results in which all the staff were asked about the administrators within their building, and then also asked about the administrators in the central office. And I would love to see those disparate results. Are they available?
Yes and no, I guess would be my response to that. So the difference being, in looking at those sort of individual results, that gets into a supervision evaluation piece, and these become then public documents for an individual, so we'd then be evaluating
Principals.
publicly or in, so, and so more or less the work of the board is to supervise me, and then my job is to supervise all the administrators that work for me. And so we'd be in violation of policy governance as well if the board was getting into each principal's survey results and what they say.
In public session.
Yeah, or even for that matter in private session, in executive session.
The survey results that we're seeing, the answers to the questions, is this the exact word, like language of the question, how the questions were asked?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the only two questions that you don't see here, again for the same reasons that I explained before, are the, it's more or less in what areas is the administrator doing well and in what areas do they need to grow. So because those were comments that were really specific to performance and to some extent identifiable and to varying degrees more or less appropriate depending on what the comment was, those also didn't seem appropriate to share in their entirety with the board. I have historically, as superintendent, when it was a survey just for me, and because you supervised me, you got to see the summary like in the same fashion that it is now in public session, and it was included in the document, in the board packet like it is now. And then in executive session, we got to look at all the comments about me, because you were my supervisor and that was an appropriate sort of relationship. Now with this summary survey, it didn't seem appropriate for that information to be shared.
Okay. And is there a reason why we did the combined survey instead of the survey in which we were able to just see your performance?
So I've done that the previous 2 years, was a survey just for about me and my interactions with staff. And the feedback from the board had been, the policy isn't so much about me personally and the way I'm treating staff, it's more globally how our staff treated. And so this is an effort to try and reflect what I think the board was looking for, a more holistic view of how our staff expressing that they're being treated.
Krista?
Can you speak to what you might do with the disaggregated results?
Sure. So what I've begun doing already, so obviously I'm looking at the results that were from the survey about me, and that's really useful, looking for patterns and trying to identify some areas that I can grow in. But I'm having those same conversations with other administrators as well. So asking them, kind of what are their takeaways, what are they seeing for patterns, what are they sort of celebrating from the feedback, and what are some areas that they're seeing that they can grow in. So it is being used to have a conversation about continued growth individually with administrators. So I have access, as superintendent, I have access to my survey and everyone else's survey that was administered, so I can have those conversations. Other administrators only have access to their own, and if they happen to have an administrator that works under them, for example, at the high school with a principal and 2 assistant principals, they can access those that work under them.
I have another question on this report.
Sure.
But I think you kind of answered it when we were talking about other line items that are going to be taken care of. And it was about the school safety procedures. And I just remember going through Beeman, and you were talking about those doors don't lock from the interior. And then there was also discussion about cameras throughout the hallways and PA systems. But I guess that's all happening.
By the end of June.
Okay?
All the locks will be done by the end of June, cameras in by the end of June, PA systems all working by the end of June.
Just curious if this might be an appropriate time to talk about how we resolve Mr. Learmouth showing up at every meeting and giving the same spiel. There's got to be a way to resolve this.
It's a good question.
That is a good question. So it is a personnel issue, and it is an ongoing issue. So in both those cases, I don't believe that's an appropriate, there's and a place for us to have a comment. Patrick and I have talked, and what may be appropriate is for me to send an email to Tom, just saying, yes, you've been heard, yes, yes, a response, but just from the chair and to him directly. I don't believe there's anything we can take any action or do anything in a public session as it's still ongoing. Kristen?
The part, though, about lack of collaboration, can that be affirmed or reaffirmed with Tom or with us and Tom? Because that seems like that's the crux of it, right? So it sounds like what you're saying is we would be evaluating Patrick's compliance with that, and that's not appropriate. But isn't there evidence about collaboration or lack thereof that we can share? That's not a personnel evaluation. That's just talking about relationship building or work that's happening together.
Maybe, but my first thought is, if we made some sort of comment, or if we did something at our meeting here kind of thing, then would Patrick then feel like it's a form of evaluation in the public eye? So, I mean, part of what I struggle is we made an error in our motion and our work, and so maybe the way to deal with it is to go back and correct the motion. I don't know, because I know we made a mistake in our language, and that's the problem. Our mistake. So, Caleb.
I'm sorry that I missed that meeting in March, but
Really?
I'm really sorry I wasn't part of that error. No, I'm just kidding. I am sorry I missed it because I feel a little uninformed talking about this. But in general, I think it's always tricky when we have issues that would seem to call for an executive session per like statutory requirement, so that we kind of remove that conversation from this group. Then also we might hear about that type of thing, which we can't respond to without an executive session during comments, which we also can't respond to. And so I think in order to get past those potentially necessary but also kind of unfortunate one-sided conversations that kind of happen as a matter of course, we have to go back and look at our policy language. And I know we've done that before for like treatment of staff type of thing, and I just want to make sure we're always asking the question, how do we not get away from the type of governance we've committed to when emotional situations rise, but how do we also remember to ask the question, well, is there something about our policy that that could be written more clearly, so that when on an annual basis or on a whenever it happens in the calendar of sort of policy review, we can gather that evidence that is appropriate to kind of show that this type of situation, there's evidence that our superintendent handles it appropriately. I maybe I'm not putting that correctly, but it's just that we can't talk about this. We can talk about the specifics so little when they're happening that we really need to make sure that when we circle around to the relevant chunk of our policy governance, that we're being pretty attentive to just how much evidence it allows us to gather, I guess, is the only way I can think to say it. These things happen in generalities so much that it feels really hard to plug specifics in, and also to draw specific conclusions sometimes in the aftermath. So anyway, I just hope that, and I think we can always use guidance on that. I don't think that we have necessarily the answers in this room for knowing, oh, if we tweak our policy in this way, or our reporting in this way, or our evidence gathering in this way, then we would have a more compelling story to tell individuals who don't feel that some part of the superintendent's position as it regards to staff or whoever else is being performed. I don't know what kind of mistake exactly was made, but my guess is that maybe we made a resolution that diverged from an existing policy.
Our language was the mistake. The language we used in our motion was wrong.
And yeah, so I guess we kind of maybe would avoid pitfalls like that with just continued clarity and work on that area, because we know it comes up.
Would it make some sense to go back into executive session over this issue and talk about the specifics of it and come out with an adjusted motion and maybe invite Tom to come and talk about it?
I think I would want to have a discussion here at the table before I agree.
Well, sure. I mean, it could be a step-by-step sort of thing.
Yeah, I would agree to.
And I think for me, thinking about that, Steve,
I wasn't there
comment
either,
was,
so I'm
right.
I'm
But your
a
comment was
little
do we go back into executive session to talk about this?
Well,
meaning it's happened previously.
It sounds like we can't talk about it otherwise.
Right. And I guess that's the piece that I'm thinking about. This is maybe the third meeting consecutively that the conversation has come up, because it's the third meeting that Mr. Lermouth has been here to make that statement.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I don't know what's different now than would have been 2 meetings ago in terms of the information shared and discussed and the position of the board. I think what's missing perhaps is what's the message the board is conveying to Mr. Lermouth. Like he hasn't gotten a message, though it's been discussed 3 meetings in a row now.
And I think that we're all pretty comfortable at this point with, just like everybody else in the system that we're talking about, hearing about, is that mistakes are going to be made, things are going to do our best, and then realize that we could have done something differently. And I don't think there's any shame in going forward and making a statement that to correct ourselves, and that is an admirable quality even, to figure out how we want to correct that and make it better. So
Proficiency-based learning, we got it 3.
And in the process, you make mistakes along the way, and you correct and revise.
Well, maybe just the executive session might just be to agree on what that message wants to be. If it's required, or if you already know what the message needs to be done.
I'm trying to think now, like,
Speaking of
under
ignorance,
what's the reasoning for the executive session would be, like, how, I suppose.
No, I know. No, I didn't.
The only board chair that
even at
brings
the executive session,
her
so I couldn't
to
tell
go
you.
into or not go to executive session, and the proper way to do so at every meeting.
I mean, is it still that?
Maybe.
I mean, that's the only, I mean,
mean, you guys came up with the motion in executive session, right?
No, we came to so we had ideas, and then when we came out and put it together, it didn't flow as well as it should have.
Oh, but it was formulated out of executive session.
Yeah. Caleb? Yeah.
I would say that if a resolution was made asking for something, that I think that, now maybe that wasn't the correct wording and we need to make some countering resolution, I don't know. But just, if it was made and we asked for something, then there should be some updating based on that request. And I think the fact that this board is not hearing any kind of update based on that request makes the comments of Mr. Laramith stand out a little bit more, because we've got nothing to compare them to. I don't know what the expectation of that resolution on the 11th was in terms of time frame, but you know, maybe we need to change something there. But if we didn't, I do think it's reasonable to, and it's so tricky when you have this stuff for very good reasons can't be discussed totally open as it relates to personnel or whatever. But I do think it's reasonable to think that after several months, there would be something coming back from that request to let this group know that progress is being made. And if the answer to why that's not coming is that the question never should have been answered or asked, or was asked wrong, or was asked in a way that violates certain statutory, then we should just like get clear on that sooner rather than later. I don't know if like tonight's the night, but if it's not, then it's probably next time. And
Sure.
and yeah, and like Liz said, if there was a mistake made, to kind of own it, because I do think that it kind of hanging out there without correction and without any action coming back is not a good place to leave it. I know I'm stating the obvious, but I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I see it a little differently in that, as far as I'm concerned, the board did see information and was satisfied with that information. It's just the nature of the information that was shared couldn't be shared publicly, which is why it happened in executive session.
Right.
So from my perspective, mission accomplished, board satisfied. That message just hasn't been conveyed yet to Mr. Laramith. So he keeps coming and making his statement. So that's the disconnect.
Yeah, so how do we convey, so we messed up in the wording of our motion, which we did in public session, which gave directives and a timeline. And then we went back into executive session to discuss what had happened.
Right.
And then, and stop me if I'm going over of what can be.
There's a fine line. But
I know. Then we, as a board, went into executive session to hear about what had happened regarding this issue. And we were satisfied. And we were in agreement, as far as I remember, that we had messed up in our wording of the motion, of the original motion, and that we were satisfied with the update that we received from Patrick.
Right.
However, that directive still exists as the motion, and there has not been a follow-up for that. So how do we rectify that piece? Do we need to go back and change the motion and take out the directives? Because I agree with Caleb, like, we need to own up with it, we need to tie this one up. Yeah.
And it
Right,
might
so
help.
one of the
It
two,
might
right?
help.
So either the directive shouldn't have been given and we take that back and we no longer expect a report. That satisfies it one way. Or the directive stands, we received a report in the executive session that can't be disclosed. We're satisfied and that the directive was accomplished. So it's one of the two. Either it no longer exists or we're satisfied with.
And are both things we can acceptably do?
I think that's part of what Don's looking at right now.
Next, Robert's rules.
Well, and frankly, I know I kind of dumped this into an action item that's not exact, maybe not be appropriate depending on the outcome of this conversation, but it could be tabled for later too. It's not necessarily pertinent to action or discussing it.
I
Can
think.
we make a new motion to accept?
Well, I
what
think
was
we
done?
could make a motion to rescind what we did and then rescind a portion of what we did. So the part where we made the mistake, we could rescind that and just let the remaining part stand as it should have and just been done. But I kind of think that's something that we'd have to give notice to, that we were going to, it's not something that we could just say, yes, we're running into a problem tonight, but maybe set it up for the next month agenda, that we're warning that this is what our topic is gonna be in executive session, and then go into executive session, make sure everybody understands, because I'm also remember, like, some of you weren't here when we received the information, so perhaps that we could go into executive session, everybody could hear that, and then we'd all be on the same page. And then, when we came out, we could then move ahead if we felt that was the thing to do, and rescind the part that was the mistake.
That makes sense to me.
Does that mean it's not a viable option to just come out and say we're satisfied?
Can I have a motion?
You mean about we're satisfied with the action, with the original motion?
No, with Patrick's previous
Response.
explanation, and I think that's what you mean, right?
Is that what you mean?
Right, I guess that feels more satisfactory to me, and perhaps the recipients, but, or, you know, just sounds like we're not just saying, oh, we're gonna forget about that motion. End of discussion.
Well, once, we could, I think that we could provide some statement around that, explaining our error to a degree, and then if that was what the board action wanted to be, would be to rescind a portion of it, then it could happen and sort of be explained in public session.
And it may be in light of the context that we'll want to confer with legal counsel
That's
ahead of whatever action it is that we take.
Right, have some options.
And I think we probably couldn't do anything tonight anyway because it's not on the agenda, it wasn't added at the beginning of the agenda.
Right. Kevin?
Tom's issue, my read on Tom is his issue is whatever happened or didn't happen didn't go through him as the focus point, which if he's in touch with his people, if you will, he must know that no, or maybe there isn't anything that has happened, you know. But I think with our motion, he's got validity with that concern, so I think we all should consider changing the motion as opposed to saying we're satisfied that something's happened, but it's not good.
So, all right, so it'll be on the agenda for the next meeting then, and we'll try and get it all our background information with Dina, and so that we can have a clear path, or options of clear paths.
And it would be nice to have some plan to come. I assume that an executive session will be involved potentially, but just because the motion is very much in the public record, I was just reviewing the exact wording here. I think it would. I hope that we will put as much of our sort of closure of. Not closure, but returning to this issue in the public record as we can, knowing that some of the process will legally have to be hidden. I just hope that we can come with a plan to make it, put as much out in the minutes as we can at the end of the discussion. And understand that full transparency is impossible.
Well, the executive session, in my point, it gives us the time to deliberate and consider without being underneath the pressure of an audience to do that properly.
And not risking inadvertently evaluating our superintendent in public session. Okay, So back on to 2.2. I let it go because I know we have to get to the bottom of it, and that's the only way to move through it, so.
It's connected to treatment to staff.
It is
Well, it is, and-
loose, it's on the fringes out there. Are there any comments or things you want added to the response form for 2.2? Last year, we asked for the collection of information as the holistic look, and we've got that this year, so people have notes about anything else? Okay, so I'm gonna run through the questions quick and then we'll go to the vote. So based on the information provided, does the board find that the superintendent's interpretation is reasonable? Does the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation? Okay. All right, so all those in favor of accepting the monitoring report 2.2 treatment of staff, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Okay, our next item is an update on negotiations. Which, the brief update I have is I signed agreements, and Tom had already signed, and Elizabeth was scheduled to come in that after I did, so.
They are ratified, it's official. Nicely done.
Okay.
People. It's a positive process. Support staff, wouldn't you say?
I'm glad I never had to go through the traditional method.
That was something. All right, on to an update from the Community Engagement Committee, and the minutes were included in the packet. Krista, I did see you sent out an email today about using the questions sort of as a guidance.
Yep. Yeah, so everyone here should have gotten that because you all have gotten the packets to interview people. And what I saw this afternoon before coming here was that 24 surveys have been entered into SurveyMonkey. So we still have a lot of work to do in getting those surveys, whether they've been done or not, onto the instrument. But we had a really good conversation at our last meeting about the purposes, and it's in that email, but I think it was a good reminder that it'll be a lot easier to make sense of the data if it follows the strict question-answer format, but at the same time, it's really valuable that we have these conversations and pull out the themes of those conversations. So that was the nature of that email that I sent out. And it's a long process, and we're going to probably be taking a break over the summer for the month of July, and then thinking about a retreat of some kind for the planning committee in August to figure out the format and structure for these more intensive conversations in each town that would be facilitated by trained folks that would ideally be adult and student teams, and would be around a theme or themes that came up from these interviews that we're having with people, as well as from the March community engagement workshop that we had. So we've talked in our committee about the fact that the feedback we get from people around themes they'd be most interested to talk about is going to help shape the format, but that we're also going to be talking about facilities in one way or another. And so as we get a better sense of what those conversations are going to look like, it would be great to have input from the board in terms of questions that we want to ask during these meetings. I don't know if folks have been following what's happening in their neighbors to the south as they contemplate their facilities plan. This is a long-range process, a long, 2 years plus process. So I think there's a lot we need to contemplate and we'd like to get information that's most valuable to bring back to this table so that this group can feel good about supporting whichever directions or decisions we think we need to make. So, you know, what I was saying before is that I think it really needs to be this kind of collaborative relationship between what's happening in the community engagement group and the folks at this table. To that end, Jen Stanley was one of our members, and she's not on the board any longer. So we have 4 folks, and if one person doesn't come, then it's hard to get a quorum. So we'd really like to ask for another person to join our group.
I can do that.
That would be great.
Sure.
Thank you. Wow, I had a whole nother pitch, but you just saved me from that. Awesome. Okay, that's great. Does anyone have any questions about what we're doing or any information?
I was wondering if with the end of the school year, and I should have thought of this at the last meeting, if we could have another week to enter the surveys in, if that would throw off our timeline too much, because the 15th, and then it's right there, and just getting a little flexibility on that week.
Yeah, I mean, I think we asked folks to put it in on the 20th, by the 20th.
By the 20th.
Do your interviews by the 15th, input by the 20th, but, you know, deadlines are helpful.
Yeah, helpful. But it's not like if you go
And
on
on
the
a case-by-case
21st.
basis, they sometimes need to be adjusted.
Okay.
So, yeah, just let me know. Because I think what we're going to do before we meet in August for our little retreat is we'll have a smaller group of folks theme that data, which is going to take a while. But I don't imagine we're going to do that.
Right on the 20th.
No.
Okay, any questions? All right, we'll keep moving along then. Legislative update, VSBA. I don't know that
I'm no longer VSBA.
They're not meeting until August.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
did you step up to that one?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yes.
Wow, there's a little back channeling going on.
Thank you. Maybe.
In everyone's mind, they heard
That's
Kevin's
not-
got it.
By the way.
It was an emphatic no, right?
Exactly. The door is open, we all just stuck our
Don,
foot in
I
there.
can give a 1-minute update.
Sure.
If it just where things wrapped up, lead testing did pass. That's going to be rolled out relatively quickly. More money was added. I think there's a real intention to fully try to fund it from the state, and there's several different kinds of fixtures. It's mostly a fixture replacement system. It's really when you install one of these bottle filling stations, you've really addressed the problem 99% of the time. The testing is designed to also look for less likely but theoretically possible issues behind the walls with lead solder. But for the most part, we're talking about fixtures that if they're more than 10 years old, they've got about up to an 8% lead content in the brass itself. And it's not like a school-wide thing. It's usually when somebody's been sitting for 12 hours, that first little bloop of water's got an elevated level, but that's what this is going to do. So that passed. Some delays to 173, which is moving special ed to census block grant model. So there's a little bit of delay is happening there. While hopefully the agency's going to be doing more professional development around that area, because without getting too into the weeds, the professional development is extremely important to the plans of 173 working, because you're going to kind of even out funding for special ed, but if a district is still incurring costs and racking up the bills at the same way they always did, and their money's gone down, it's coming in, that's not going to be not going to be a helpful situation.
And there's really so much more to it than even just the funding. Like, the funding's a big piece of it.
Big piece of it, yeah.
I've heard it described as more complicated than Act 46.
Yeah, it's a really big initiative. It's big. And so there's some delay happening there. That's another thing. There's an interesting, the last thing I'll just mention is there was a farm to school bill that's cool in our district. It's got such an amazing food program that I think we're probably ahead of this already, but it is a requirement. I would call it a pretty loose requirement because the way you calculate a lot of this stuff is pretty discretionary, but all school districts are being asked to try to have 20% of all food be locally sourced, which I think is, for our district would probably be a step backwards, and I don't think we're gonna do that, but for a lot of, as a statewide standard, I think it's a cool thing, and there's been a little bit of, help for that programming, so.
I think our food service director testified.
Yes, Kathy Alexander was, I think, the main witness to that whole thing. So that was a cool thing to see passed, and one that's definitely, I think our district is one of the leaders in the state, so it's always nice to see. So there's other things as well, but those were a couple that I'd mentioned last time that, so some delays, the new lead program, a little bit of farm to school stuff, and then delays on a number of fronts of major initiatives that hopefully will not be indefinitely delayed.
Great, thank you. Okay, next item is discussion around our summer board retreat. In the past, we've been at Zeno Mountain. We've identified a few topics and gone for that. After our mini retreat, it's obvious from the comments here that we need some more policy governance work continuing on. I think everybody filled this out, so I think it's worth investing in some more policy governance work.
And I guess part of what I'd be interested in hearing, so does Zeno Mountain continue to work? I've already spoken with the folks at Zeno, and we are absolutely welcome back there. And they have some flexibility in the month of August, which is typically when we've had our retreat. So I think we can make that work if that is something that you want to continue to do. And we can do the catering, make it look a lot like what it has in the past. I feel like it has served us well. Beautiful spot. They're really hospitable. I'm seeing a lot of nodding, so
Yeah.
taking that as okay, we'll move forward. I can ask Karen to send a doodle poll to try and narrow down a date that works. What we've done historically, maybe we've done a couple of different ways, sort of an all-day, like 9 to 5.
Yep.
And have we also done it where we started a little bit later and went later into the evening? Or maybe we just discussed that. I don't remember if we actually did it or.
I think that was in the doodle poll. There were staggered times where one started later and went longer.
Okay, so
Because
same length of time, but one started early, ended earlier, the other started later and ended later.
Right, and
So we can do that as well.
tacked on the last hour and a half or so as a regular business,
Right.
to take care of our regular business, so that we weren't trying to do that during the, that education time.
Yeah. And then, an idea of some of the topics, I've jotted some notes about, which I regretfully didn't bring with me tonight, but some ideas of things that I think could be useful. But I'd love to hear, obviously, what your interest is. Policy governance, certainly. But there's any number of things that could be really beneficial. I don't know if something comes to mind now, but because it'll take some work to start finding folks that have expertise in the areas that we're interested in learning more about and getting those lined up once we have a date. And it's best to start that sooner rather than later.
I'd be interested too in just conversations about, again, the decline in enrollment facilities, and after reading all the stuff that's happening in Madison Central, just mindful of how they're going through the process and what it sounds like and what people are saying in letters to the editor, and just for us not necessarily coming with any action item out of that, but just throwing lots of ideas and conversation about that.
Yeah, brainstorming session.
So last year we had the work around some of the committee structure, but we haven't successfully formed any structures yet. So I guess maybe we're doing that work with
What kind of structure?
the council
Oh, school-based
so maybe we're doing that work. Never mind, we're doing that with Susan and. It's then also back, and this is when I was doing the monitoring report, there was a question in one about there was a motion to form a labor management committee, and it was tabled until September when more information would be provided. So did we decide that wasn't needed? Did we still need information about what a labor management committee would do? Is that something we needed training on? Not sure what the question.
That originally was, Krista, I think you looked into it and you contacted Cynthia Jeffries, the mediator who worked with us. And you came back and there was a recommendation that we not.
No, actually, I think that this group decided that it didn't fit with policy governance. Because her feeling was that it was advantageous to have some sort of ongoing relationship, or maybe it wasn't with policy governance, it was with negotiations. That it's a tricky thing to establish without being in a formal negotiation process.
She has pretty much said that all along in the time that we had worked with her, that she brought up the subject, but then as the more we got into the work, she backed off and said she didn't think it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I don't remember that part. Because I thought out of the RBO, that was one of the recommendations.
There was initially, but as we began the work, she pushed more to the parking lot, to the other work, kind of thing. And in a way, you have that sort of thing ongoing right now with your practice of meeting regularly with them.
And that was my memory, that it sort of crossed both, that if there's a group of board members meeting regularly with a group of teachers or the association, it's hard to imagine what those conversations are that could be productive, that aren't either negotiating outside of negotiations, which is concerning, or making decisions on means going around me. Those are the two areas that kind of complicated that group for me.
So in terms of the council discussion, are we saying right now that the community engagement process that we're embarking on at the moment, that's taking the place of the council process?
I would say, because I saw on 5/29/18, our minutes requested the Community Engagement Committee to investigate establishing additional structures. And so that doesn't have to be councils, but it could be.
Doesn't have to be councils, right. That's what we've said all along, it doesn't have to be. But.
Right, but it could be, and it is a structure, and it is, just from my own personal opinion, I guess, something I'm interested in getting community feedback around for sure, because it would help if we were talking about a bond and we were talking about getting information out there and getting feedback. That would just be such a great thing to have, or maybe not, I don't know, but it's still relevant in my opinion.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so the Community Engagement Committee doesn't take the place of a school council, but I think what Liz is referring to is these conversations that we want to have in the fall. And just like with the facilities conversation, I think there's like some information the board or the administration would provide to help frame those conversations. So similarly, I think probably one of the more popular topics to discuss at some point in the near future is pathways of communication in our schools. So we might provide school councils as a possible framework in that conversation. So I think that's where we'll hopefully tackle that. Or at least start talking more clearly about it.
That's a benefit of a retreat, right? That you have hours dedicated to really dig into a few topics that are difficult to make forward progress on in a 2 or 3 hour meeting where you have lots of other business to attend to. So I think having that conversation about pathways of communication, i.e. councils, I don't think it's necessarily something that has to be separate from the work of the community engagement. It may be something that I think really accompanies that work nicely. And it feels to me like that's something that's still kind of hanging out there. And Sue may be able to help us work that forward, but I don't think we have clarity yet where are we going with it.
Right.
It'd be good to try to take some steps to gain that clarity.
Sir, so I don't want to ask this of the community engagement committee, but is it something that that retreat will have already occurred and that we might spend a little bit of time at our retreat talking about, like next steps, so we're well prepared?
I know.
Not a ton of time, but just like.
I know, I was thinking in my head about that.
Like, do you want to
I think-
overcommit or not? Yeah, that doesn't seem okay.
Right, but I think what would be great is if we know from the data, here's where it looks like we're gonna spend some time talking about the fall. And then we can bring that to the board to say, are there any frames you wanna help put around this conversation? And can we talk about some of those at our retreat? So that would be awesome if those stars aligned.
Well, it seems like I recall there was some interest from the Community Engagement Committee in having the board meet first to offer clarity to the Community Engagement Committee. So it's interesting,
Right, I guess we'll know more about what the community input is on topics to discuss.
Right.
But
Or summary?
I wonder if there's a way to get more information about school-based councils, just as a place to continue what was a little bit of a discussion last year at the retreat, and then give us a little more knowledge, and maybe then we can, say, okay, you work on these, but here's what we as a board have decided, we're gonna start moving in this direction on this topic or something. Caleb?
You just made me think, I think it sounds great, and as time goes on, I'm just not sure school-based councils is necessarily, I just think that maybe topic-based councils, I think of some of the energy groups, I know that some of the energy groups in our different towns are working together more, and anyway, I would like to explore whether anybody's doing that as well, because since the district is one district now, I can understand the urge to have it be school-based, so it's town-based, so it kind of keeps that town-by-town connection, but I can also see that there's all these issues that really transcend the town-by-town level that it would be nice to have engagement on as well. So anyway, just keeping both of those paths in mind might be good.
So I know Nicole had spent some time looking at what other people were doing.
Yeah.
And it seemed as though what she found was pretty thin, from what I recall. But she did have her presentation gave pointers as to what people found were successful. I wouldn't mind going through that thing I handed out a little while back, just to show, one, how the local thing doesn't really, there may be a way to do it so that you're not talking about district-wide issues at a local school council. But we talk about district things on a district-wide level, but I think the thing that's missing out of not having them, or some other mechanism, is the feedback loop. It's just, that's the thing that's missing. So.
Krista?
And I wonder if we had, what you put together and went back to the information from Nicole, and we came up with some, because I think what happens is we discuss it, but then we're lacking that input from the people not here. But if we came up with some, like, what do we need to really figure out what would work best for our district? And I think that input from the community is a big part of that. And maybe we came up with a couple of questions, and maybe we don't need to wait for a, in-depth town-by-town conversation. Maybe we could do a survey, or but that might be how we take the next step, because I think we decided, or we had hesitated to pick one, just this small group. And I wonder if we would get to that same conclusion if we look at these options again. But if we look at them again and come with questions we want to help us guide what we ultimately choose, that's where that committee, I think, can.
And the thing that I handed out was mainly meant to spur conversation. It wasn't, it could be far too rigid a structure to try to even implement the way it's laid out, but it gives you things to think about. It's some of the comments that I've gotten back on it are, why don't we just let these things happen organically? Like, if this Robinson wanted to start a school day council, just let them. And then they could develop it any way they wanted to. Which is kind of what happened at Mount Abe the other day. So that could be one way for it to happen, is it simply happens organically. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is to have more structure to it.
I think it ties into our policy governance training as well, because from what I found online, it may not be a lot of school-based councils, but looking into policy governance and boards that really follow that more in the business world, they have councils, right? So like Nicole was talking about up with the town planning. So that is a piece that I think would also address our wanting to really stay policy governance. And then that's the expansion that fills in some of the weaknesses that policy governance has. So I think somehow that's a part of that conversation to me. I don't know.
Do you feel like you have enough?
Sorry, yeah.
I think we want to talk about communication, councils, governance, and sort of how they're all sort of interconnected. We also have the declining enrollment, facilities, things that might connect to that theme.
Is anybody planning to go to the critical board work? What's the name of it? The thing on June 1st?
Essential, is it?
Essential.
Yes.
Yes.
Essential work for
Yes.
school boards.
Just curious. I didn't know anybody was like planning. I know people have maybe gone before. I was thinking of doing it again.
Yeah, if you are interested in going, it's definitely not too late. Just email Karen and she'll get you registered and everything paid for and all that stuff. And I think did a flyer? You all got a flyer about it,
Yeah, I
right?
sent everybody an email, so, yep. Okay. We're gonna keep moving along, because the next item is a discussion item. It's the article that Val, I know it wasn't a great copy, she copied it and sent it, and
It kind of terminated at some point. which I
yeah,
was-
you couldn't sort of read but you could get the gist of it. We did, after I read the article, I sent it to Patrick. He read the article and he said, that's a great article. And then we passed it on to Karen to put in the agenda and she had the same reaction. And so I thought it would be valuable to have that, physically have that book. So that's in the works.
Yep.
There also is that site.
Is it available in PDF?
No, this was literally, it's a.
No, is the book itself available
I
in
don't,
PDF?
I don't think so. I think it was just a hard copy, the one there was only one place I could find it as I was looking for it, so. But we'll see once it arrives. But did everybody get a chance to read the article? I mean, I know people left the mini retreat, some with some clarity on some things and more questions on another, and I think like just presenting ourselves with more information will be helpful. There's a website, the Policy Governance Coach. I think I've sent you an article from it in the past. They have a lot of great articles if you just want to read bits and pieces and short little articles that could be very helpful if you're, kind of feeling like, I don't know how to answer that, or I don't really understand that. I would recommend going to that site and just clicking around. Coach? I think it's Policy Governance Coach, or I sent an article to you at one point, to everybody.
Governance
Coach.
Yeah. Governance Coach.
Yeah, if you want to get more of that information, I think you have to
Sign up for the newsletter, and so you can get stuff.
Does your board need help?
I don't know if anyone had any comments. Which one is, does your board need help? Yes. Yes. All right. Okay, and I'll keep moving. Action to accept the monitoring report for 4.6 board committee structure. If
And there was a feedback sheet included if you wanted to write any comments down to sort of gather your thoughts. Is there a motion to accept it?
So moved.
Steve, is there a second? Caleb? Any discussion? Liz?
So other than what I already mentioned about the other things, this, I thought it was interesting that this was only for the board committee structure and not the actual board structure, in which case it would have included that we've added students and that we've had conversations about including staff, and haven't finished that train of thought yet, but it's just committee structure. But I thought it would have been nice to be able to know that we do have student reps joining us next year, so I think that's also worth mentioning.
Next year?
Is that something else for the retreat agenda? Talk about how that works?
Well, we did take action to have members, to have the student members, so, and I think it happened probably right before my son went in the hospital, so as I was coming here tonight, I was like, hey, whatever happened? So,
Same thing.
I have a note right here, student reps on the board, so I'll dig back into it and
Because
figure
there were
out.
some things that the board had to do along with that too, like
Right.
there's some
I'll dig,
orientation and some other stuff that had to go.
right. I'll dig back in and see where we are, kind of thing, and
And I made a note on the list of possible retreat agenda items, so
yeah.
Keep us remembering that.
Any other questions regarding 4.6? So based on the information provided, was the interpretation reasonable?
Yes.
Okay. Did the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation? Okay. So all those in favor of accepting 4.6 board committee structure monitoring report, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Thanks, Liz.
Yes, thank you. Okay. We are not in need of an executive session.
We don't?
No. So, is there any public comment?
Just birthday present, Andrew.
Okay. Before you all get up and run away, close the door. Don't go without, in the consent agenda, we approved the tax anticipation note, and we need signatures of at least 7 members, so please don't leave without signing that. Second thing is, I need a couple more signatures on this, this thing that came around. It had names from ANESU, and people might have thought not to sign it, but it just got missed. It was already approved, and signatures got missed, and since we're the governing board, if you didn't sign it, because we need a couple more signatures.
Do we need to sign on each of these red lines?
yes, there
Yes.
are, yes.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I'm gonna pass around for the board stipend. If you would fill in your name and sign this so that they can have it, so you can get your stipend, that would be great. And don't leave and take this home and give it back.
Is that on the pass? I guess that one looks filled.
Oh, how would you guys sit? For many hours? Just one? So moderate.
Yeah.
Allison started that, and yeah, so I devoted a lot of time to that.
Oh, I'm so excited now.
I know, right?
I just looked at the ACSD's, their agenda, and they started at 7:30, and it's like, discussion, facilities master plan. They started at 7:30.
Thank you.
Their agenda looks so different though.
Yeah, so, anybody who knows somebody in Bristol, that seat is still open for this board, and the select board has not And any response? Thank you. So if you know somebody, if you want to nudge, feel free to nudge.
Has anybody nudged Sally Burrell yet? I asked her at one point.
I feel like she was nudged at the community.
She okay. That's what I did, and then.
She did say no to the retirement.
Yeah, how do I do that?
Click on the link.
Sorry.
So not good. We haven't adjourned yet, kids.
Yeah, we haven't adjourned yet.
Sit down.
I just had some homework that we had to do.
Okay, so this links me somewhere. Date of meeting, 5/28/19.
Sarah's running through the board evaluation.
Here I go. What is the level of engagement of all board members?
Hi.
Hi.
I'd say.
Was the agenda followed?
Yes.
Yes. Feel free to chime in with comments. How would you describe the board chair's effectiveness in establishing agendas and selecting materials for distribution to the board? Unsatisfactory, acceptable, good, very good.
Very good.
How would you describe the board chair's effectiveness in fostering a professional culture of the board regarding board climate, full participation of all board members, and ongoing board training? Unsatisfactory, acceptable, good, very good.
Very good.
I'll go very good. I like very good.
Other feedback for the chair?
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you.
What went well with the meeting? Did you like the proficiency presentation?
Presentation, questions, engagement.
Thought the energy thing was interesting.
Done by the
Yeah.
Proficiency.
Don't go, and we
Yes.
don't have signatures on these, and we don't have any money.
Did you say energy comments?
I like the energy presentation.
Who did an energy presentation?
At the beginning.
You missed it.
You missed it.
Oh.
I was like, boy, you really didn't like that presentation.
Alright. What else? Length. Okay.
Can I borrow your?
What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings?
Sarah didn't show up on time.
I was at lacrosse practice in the rain.
Timely
Thank you very
arrival, board
much.
members, timely arrivals.
Were they at 271 meeting?
No, but
There were two board members here at 6 o'clock.
there were only 2 board members here, so.
I was hoping to be here.
Thank you.
Lacrosse went till 6:30 in Moncton and it's boring.
Is that it?
Double booked. Time.
We didn't adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn.
All right, Sarah's making a
Second.
All right, all those in favor of adjourning at 8:43, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
That's done, huh?
Any abstentions?